Hello. On this episode of the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, we have Vadym Honcharenko. He is the Data Privacy and Data Protection Manager at Grammarly in the Ukraine. During this show, we talk a bit about the Italian Data Protection Authority that a couple of days earlier had banned ChatGPT in Italy. Since the time of that recording, OpenAI has come to an agreement with Italy. So now ChatGPT is unbanned in Italy. But during the conversation, we talk at a higher level about what these generative AI tools mean to data protection, not only in Europe, but also in other jurisdictions. Enjoy the show. Personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest on the show, Vadym Honcharenko. He is privacy and data protection at Grammarly in Europe. I know Grammarly very well. Ukraine originated company. You're in Poland right now. I actually looked up my stats recently on Grammarly because I want to tell you about it. So I think I've been using Grammarly for, I think they say 270 weeks. So it's been a long time. And I really like the tool, but I would love to know your trajectory into privacy and what got you interested in this role at Grammarly.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Debbie, for inviting me. As you said, my role is related to privacy and data protection at Grammarly. Grammarly is about AI, we all know, and it's a great intersection between technology, privacy role that I'm in it at Grammarly. Mostly covers the questions, both legal and technical, for evaluating different privacy risks for new features at Grammarly, some kind of critical changes in the way we process data in our systems, like critical vendors, onboarding, etc. So, my role is about legal and both technical aspects of finding the right way and to make our users privacy rights at best of it.
I think you're in an interesting space. So you're at a technology company. So you guys are considered leaders in the way that you're using AI and AI tools, but then also you're running a company. So then you have internal things that you have to think about. You're in Europe, but you also your product is used all over the world and you have offices in different countries. So tell me a little bit about that. How does that make your job more complex, more interesting? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, for sure. When the business is provide their services all over the world, and of course, like that's why we need to collect the data to provide our services. It gets more and more complicated all over the world regarding the privacy regulations, which are getting more and more complicated. But first of all, the framework that I personally use, I would say, is that, we've got that standard, I would say, that the GDPR raises the bar and different other regulations all over the world, trying to find the right balance between their local standards and high bar of the GDPR and user rights, privacy rights, etc. But I think that it makes this fact that other countries and regulations are getting closer to the GDPR as a higher standard makes things easier to some extent. Therefore, we don't have to think through this as well what GDPR says. Now we can just understand it in a way that what the privacy regulations all over the world say. Of course, there are some differences, no doubt about it. For example, comparing to the US frame privacy regulations and requirements and the EU-based requirements. But generally speaking, yeah, we're starting with something related to EU, for example, covering everything, getting back to the US, whether we need to address some specific concerns around the US laws in different states like California and all other states that are getting through this process all over the way and making their laws more and more comprehensive and specific to user rights. So yeah, of course, covering different regulations all over the world one by one and trying to make this process less complicated, but that's not always how it can be done, of course.
Yeah. Well, one of the tricks that I use to figure out or navigate a lot of the privacy laws is that a lot of the regulations that were passed between 1995 and 2018 very much follow the European Data Directive. So, and then the ones after GDPR came out, a lot of those borrow a lot from GDPR. So that's how I do it. So if I know like the date or when a certain law was passed, I know like what was happening around that time. And so, as you were saying, I'm glad to see the GDPR definitely is the gold standard because it's the most comprehensive one in the world. And we've seen since 2018, a lot of countries, even states in the US, have borrowed stuff from the GDPR. I think that does definitely help. I think in the US, it's sort of annoying because we have different states trying to pass different laws. In some ways, I think they want to put their own little spin on it. So it's like different enough to be annoying without being completely different. So I think it just makes it more complex.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially I was the most like the example that it raised in my mind is personal data breach notification requirements. In US, every state has its own rules, right? So you need to get the updates regarding this. But as you more than sure that you've heard about the new guidance for data breach notification from the EDPB, and first of all related to the requirements for non-EU controllers and who has their representatives in the EU in some country, that in a case when the breach will cover a lot of countries, you would need to inform every country specifically and mostly. First of all, when considering the special requirements of every country. So probably that also makes things complicated, but we'll see how it will go from the business practice.
What in the world is happening right now concerns you in privacy? Like something that you see happening, you're like, oh my goodness, I don't like the way that this is going. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's an interesting one. Yeah, like first of all is things that are everybody's chatting through is ChatGPT and the Gen AI and privacy aspects of the things that Italian DPA covered in the recommendations that they published not a couple of days ago, as far as I remember. So I think that would be the trend in how EU DPAs and actually countries all over the world will look through this tendency, because we all know that Canada also started the investigation, and in US also there were like kind of concerns from different organizations including to the FTC to start the investigation and look through how it all works from the privacy perspective. So I think that wouldn't say that it makes me that I'm not like the way it goes. I would just say that how excited I am of that these things are happening, because it could make things clearer for everybody, right? and including for the companies that making their business around AI and privacy, which are, like specific aspects of these kind of services. And probably like specifically, it would be the things related to the EU law, and mostly for when I was looking through the requirements and the concern that Italian DPA raised for ChatGPT, the most important aspect for me was the legal basis for collecting and processing EU users' data for development purposes, because the same concern was raised earlier, that you remember, on the Meta enforcement for advertising, and including for using data for development purposes, which they use as a contract necessity, which is not the case. That's why they had the issues around this. And now ChatGPT is also reconsidering their practices and communication they use in their privacy policies, terms, etc., regarding what would be the right legal basis for using data for development purposes, developing features for AI, etc. I think this is an interesting trend that, as I mentioned, started in Meta enforcement, and now it's also been raised in Italian case for ChatGPT. So now the question is if that should be consent or legitimate interest. Let's say if it's legitimate interest, what are the additional guidance that EU DPAs might provide regarding the balancing, the right aspects of balancing users' rights and users' privacy rights and companies' interest for development purposes? Of course, we all know the guidelines that we already have from the companies, from the DPAs, but it would be, I think this is the stage where there is a necessity to have more guidance around this. And I think these two cases, especially ChatGPT, and we know that Spain also wants to investigate on this case around ChatGPT. I think this stage is something that would need to give us more clarity on this, because as we all know, most of the companies that use AI, that use data for developing their features, most of them rely on legitimate interest in their privacy policies.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. I think one of the things that AI does, especially AI that uses data from the internet to power their tools, the issue that I see that comes up around privacy, and this is how jurisdictions are grappling with it, is that a lot of the laws are written in a way like you have data, you give it to someone else, and then they try to give people control over what happens with the data that you give someone. But if there's data just open on the internet, certain jurisdictions, there's no law against companies sucking data from the internet, right? Because they assume in some way, if it's public in some way, that you've given consent. Two of the big things I think this comes up here is that I think AI or generative AI tools raise more privacy risks because it pulls in more data from humans. These AI tools that aren't typically transparent. But then the undercurrent of this is that a lot of laws haven't really addressed, in my view, a situation where data is not. So I didn't give ChatGPT data about me, right? But there's data about me on the internet. So how do we manage that? Especially, when I tell a lot of my European friends, because they are in Europe and they're under GDPR, things like data scraping is not legal. But in the US, it is. So I think that these different different jurisdictions looking into this issue is a good thing, because I think this is the space where like data brokers live, and this is where they thrive, in that gray space that hasn't really been defined. So, but what are your thoughts there?
That's a really good point. Yeah, the things that we see now in the Italian DPA case with the ChatGPT. We'll get in back to this example again, but it's super interesting. The case is that it actually practically addresses the EU law requirement that even though the data is public and it's personal data, it doesn't matter. The data about this or that user which is public is personal data, and there are no difference regarding the requirements around it. So the risk level, the risk tolerance of the public personal data of somebody is not lower, so the requirements are still the same. We know this, but it's still interesting that in the ChatGPT case, this requirement becomes like super practical, right? And we also saw that Italian DPA in their requirements for April 30 or the middle of May to be implemented by OpenAI, also related to these kind of concerns for users and non-users, so that they can jump in, register, look through, find the settings to opt out of this data to be used. So this is pretty simple, but nobody does it at this stage. And such companies with such specific practices, as you mentioned, when they scrap the data publicly, they didn't think through this. And I think that another good example, which was raised, is about Clearview AI, the company that uses public public pictures from different social media profiles of people all over the world, and use it to create some kind of biometrical identifier and pattern, so that if you want to find somebody, you can do this with their database. So there were a lot of concerns around it from different EU-based DPAs for the Clearview AI, but it sounds like this specific requirement that it is still somebody's personal data, doesn't matter that it is public. I think this specific case was not finalized to some extent, I would say. Therefore, now EU kind of takes round two for this specific requirement to make everybody aware that data scrapping, when it relates to somebody's personal data, is not legal and requires that same kind of requirements.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that. So this is like the second round of trying to address that issue. So Clearview AI, they got booted out of a couple of countries, some in Europe, I think in Australia as well. They had a case against them in the US, a couple of cases against them in the US where I think they were barred in some way from selling their tool to law enforcement for a period of time or something like that. In the US, I don't think the issue was data scraping. I think the issue was them data scraping, putting it in a database, and then using it for law enforcement. So I think it had a commercialization aspect to it that could cause harm, right? So basically, and then in the US, we have this whole thing about you're innocent until proven guilty. But if you're scraping data, putting everybody in a database, you're almost creating a situation where you're guilty until proven innocent, right? So I think that has a different connotation, I think, in the US than it does in other countries. So, it's just interesting to see. I would love to see more talk around this. And I think also we're on a collision course with transparency in AI. So transparency has been like the biggest, not the biggest, but one of the most major issues around privacy as it relates to AI, I think relates to transparency. So it's like, okay, you have this cool tool. It does this cool thing. How do I know as a consumer what it's doing and then what it's doing with my data? So I think that we're not even sure what all Chat GPT or these generative models are doing, right? So I think these regulations or different jurisdictions are trying to do is try to create more transparency. And like you say, like Canada studying what's happening with ChatGPT. And part of that is around transparency. How do we create regulation against something that we don't truly understand? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. And transparency was raising, again, I'm getting back to the meta example because from my understanding, it also raised like transparency, fairness, all other aspects that are related to these kind of like requirements. I wouldn't say like GDPR. It's transparency is basic thing that should be covered in any regulation and even out of the specific regulatory requirements, because it's a business. It should be a business practice, so that the first thing that would create user trust around the data that this service collects and more specifically for these kind of services. But yeah, like the transparency, this aspect of the requirements for including for the AI-based and Gen AI tools that are they're being created all over the world from different services. I think that we're now in a stage, including getting back to the requirements of the Italian DPA specifically, but the global tendency, I think, is about making these things more explicit to the user while they use this or that service. What I mean here is that it is the time when we need to think about the explainability as a transparency. So it means that the user would not need to, hey, please read our privacy policy. Everything is there. Well, even though it is not always the case that it is there, right? Even the user would go and read, doesn't mean that they would get a lot of transparency. Even if it would be described good, no, not all the people want to do this and would be able to understand. So I think that the better things around satisfying the transparency is also not just about telling some kind of things in the privacy policy, which are required by different regulations, including GDPR, etc., which is a good thing. But I think that we need to think about the context, which is about when you provide some kind of data, the just-in-time notice for this or that action and controls and settings that the user might have to have and to feel full control of their data would be also a good aspect to add transparency, not just making the things in privacy policy or something like this.
Right.
Simple as that, but
yeah. It sounds simple. I did a video a while back around incremental consent, which is as we move through these tools and people are deciding different features that they want to use, instead of having like an 80-page privacy policy, which maybe you still have that, right? But as people are choosing different paths for different things that they want to use, maybe have situations where they're being informed during their journey within the tool about what's happening. I think that's a great thing, so that it won't be like, oh, well, too bad you didn't read this 80-page privacy policy before you did this tool. And I think it's very important, especially I work a lot with people who are developing tech in like the metaverse, like augmented reality and stuff. And so having that during journey in terms of being able to have people make choices during that thing, I think it's going to become even more important. So I want to talk about AI in general. You have a very sophisticated tool. I like it a lot. I like that you all are always forward thinking and how develop new features that I'm always excited about. But I think, I talked at a conference yesterday about legal innovation, and I was trying to tell people, regardless of what happens with Chat GPT, generative AI, and large language models, that type of capability will be incorporated in tools that maybe they use every day, right? So people need to get accustomed to maybe learning how to prompt or what AI is doing so that they, have more of a comfort there. So give me your thoughts about that.
yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that not getting back to the specific tendencies around ChatGPT and the Italian case. I agree that this prism of having these opportunities in different services to make a prompt and to receive I don't know, an email generated for some recipient, and you feel that this is a really good tool because you don't have to spend a lot of time on this task. This is a really cool tendency, and this pattern, this technical possibility would be implemented into different services. That's for sure. That would it be ChatGPT, or we call it different ways. Would it be OpenAI as a provider, or the other companies like Microsoft and Google, etc.? This is the tendency, and we as humans, we felt this cool cool feature that should be provided to us. As for the privacy aspects and tendencies around this, I think that the best tools would be that provide the information, or first of all, what data would need to be processed and stored, and for how long, etc., about the user, so that they have this context. And the second is the practices the company use for having users' privacy as the highest priority when they develop these features and when they provide these kind of features. First of all, it's the things around the data minimization, when you think through this task as first of all understanding whether we need all these data elements to provide this kind of service. This is the most important part of every tool, including these kind of tools which are Gen AI and privacy around this. So second part would be the requirements for the data processing environments and security aspects of this. So I think that sufficient level of transparency and controls in privacy settings, dashboards, just-in-time notices, and things around data minimization and data security would be the most trended thing for these kind of services.
We're definitely in a new frontier here, and I think it's going to even raise privacy even higher than it has been, because now we have tools that are using data in different ways maybe we didn't expect. So it's not a straight line in terms of how data goes in. It comes from all different areas. So you have situations where maybe multiple companies are gathering data about people. We had a guy, I don't know if you saw this in the news, where this is in the US, where a guy said that someone asked ChatGPT about him, and they said that he had done some crime that he hadn't done or something. And so he's suing them to figure out why it says that. I would love your thoughts. People have been chatting about this on LinkedIn, and this is about the hallucinations, which I don't think the word hallucination really captures what happens in these tools, because when you think of a hallucination, you think about something that is just unexpected that happens, where you have situations where you may ask a tool something and it's giving you a very confident answer that sounds plausible in some way, but may not exactly be true. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that privacy aspect that we discussed that would be important for these kind of services is one side, but of course things around, first of all, bias, and around things which is mostly, of course, related to privacy, about accuracy is crucial, because the ChatGPT case raised the concerns for privacy, and users now understand what they might missed in this specific case. But from the user's perception perspective, the first thing that they would probably see next when they would not receive the good level of transparency, what would happen with their data, etc. The next thing that they would definitely notice is that the tool provides some kind of, as you mentioned, hallucination or incorrect data about the person. For example, as we know this example about saying that some specific person was deceased when it was alive, and different other examples to your point. It is something that is really harmful, first of all, from not just from the privacy, but from different perspective. It discriminates the user. It's harmful, and these kind of things should also be on the list of these companies, because otherwise nobody would use it if things would happen as unfortunately happen at some stage to the OpenAI, with users and other users' information in their history of their prompts. So yeah, like privacy and security is important, but things around bias and things that might discriminate in general, and things that might be perceived as harmful for the user, these are the things we need to see. Because when a company like OpenAI use the public data, they at first need to think about that, let's call them filters, that they are using for then providing this information and a response to this or that prompt. This is not about saying that this is all in the internet, all these tendencies, all these biases, all these injustices that we scrapped through the data. This is not the internet's fault. This is not, partly probably not the human's fault, but this is the company's responsibility to implement these kind of controls for the content, so that it would be like kind of sensitivity controls, so that they are not harmful to the users. And of course, these kind of things are related to those companies that buy their services as a product in use for their services. Because even though the other company that buy let's say ChatGPT as a service, they are also responsible for these kind of sensitivity filters as well. But the company is at OpenAI, which collected this data, is the first responsibility to provide their services in this responsible way as well. So yeah.
Yeah, this is just a whole new world. I think we're all going to be very busy talking about AI and how it's going to change a lot of what we do and how it's going to really elevate the conversation, I think, around privacy. And as you said, like I had a friend where it said ChatGPT said he had passed away a few years ago. And he's trying to figure out, like, where did you get that from? Like, that's nowhere on the internet. So, like, how did you come up with that answer? And I think part of this, in my view, is that companies that create tools where they want to give an answer, it wants to give you an answer. And so if you enter something into a chat bot and it didn't give you an answer, you probably like, oh, this thing sucks. Like, I don't want to use it, right? So maybe what they're trying to do is generate answers even when they don't have it, and making up things. Even this guy, when he prompted it about, it's like, okay, so this person died, like show me the obituary. And it came up with a fake link from like the Guardian. It made up a link on the fly that was supposed to be to the Guardian newspaper obituary, which wasn't true. So, I mean, obviously, a human created these tools, so you can't like blame the AI that it does this, So, if it were the world according to you, Vadim, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy or technology or AI or anything anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, human behavior, technology? What are your thoughts?
I think that in the high level, I wish that companies all over the world, and first of all, like business leaders for the biggest companies like Google, like Facebook, like Amazon, and all big companies. First of all, which collect the most the most of information about users all over the world because we all use their tools. I think that these kind of companies would should my wish would be that they would use the data in a more responsible way from the privacy perspective, because you know things are which are related to profiling, which are related to advertising and using the data for different un, unusual for the user, or even the purposes that I would not be even aware of, is something that is a global trouble, I would say. And the Meta case was unfortunately a good example on this front regarding the usage of users' personal data for advertising purposes. I was when I was looking through this case, I was just asking myself, in what way would I even know that even though even if I go to that privacy policy or terms of service, how would I know that all the data that I use and I, let's say, generate while using Facebook would be used for advertising purposes for me? And I said, when I generate in Facebook, that is even not the case, as we know that from the technological perspective, you don't even need to be a Facebook user so that they would use your data, which might be through the like buttons, etc. There are a lot of researchers around this. So I think that would be a good point. So that everybody knows and more trust and have more trust to big companies, and that becomes a good standard, business standard for smaller companies. And this the responsible usage of personal data, and which is all clear and not about just satisfying the regulatory requirements, which is unfortunately not even the case right now, but having this this level of understanding that this is a business standard and I need to do this because this is a good practice, and then specifying and satisfying different regulatory requirements on top of that. But not the regulatory requirement should be a first point of view, but the the attitude to the user as the highest value, and their privacy should be the first point.
Right. So I think what we're moving towards now is a situation where companies can't just think about their own business interests, especially as it relates to them touching the data of humans. And I have to tell people this. It's like products and services that you create are for humans. So you should be concerned about their trust and also protecting the data that they entrust you with. So that's a great point. That's a great point. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it, all the way from Poland. And I know that other people will really love this. We need to get together probably maybe in a year or so, see how things are played out with generative AI. I'm sure it'll have a lot more adoption as we see it seep into a lot more different tools for sure. I think it's totally going to change and elevate the privacy conversation for sure.
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, and I agree that 1 year is a good term, because these things are getting more and more intense. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see new requirements. We'll see new business standards. And thank you again for this great catch up on privacy topics.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay.